As is always the case, we save the best for the last. It is my pleasure to introduce the panelists. On the screen, we have Professor Cynthia Williams from Mara School of Law at Indiana. She is a leading expert on the intersection between corporate and securities law and climate change. Next, on my left, we have Mr. Dylan Pillay, Executive Director and CEO of Temasek Holdings, one of the world's largest and most highly regarded investment companies. This will be Mr. Pillay's third speaking engagement today, so we are very grateful he made time for this important event. Beside Dylan, we have YK Park, who is the Asia Pacific Managing Director of APG Asset Management Asia, which is a subsidiary of APG Group headquartered in the Netherlands. APG is one of the world's largest pension investors. Finally, we have Ms. Ghislaine Nadu, Senior Sustainable Investment Specialist from Robeco and International Asset Manager. She leads the firm's engagement programs on human rights, palm oil, and just transition in Asia Pacific. Now, investors' fiduciary duty is a very timely and important topic. This year alone, 3 influential organizations issued reports on this topic. They are the UK Financial Markets Law Committee, FMLC, the Net Zero Lawyers Alliance, NZLA, and the United Nations Principles for Responsible Investment, UNPRI. Investors owe fiduciary duties to their principals or beneficiaries. They have to balance returns against risks as they pursue financial returns for their beneficiaries. Given that climate risks, as the 2 previous panels have clearly demonstrated, can materially affect investors' duty to balance returns against risks, investors must consider climate risks and opportunities in their decision-making process. For example, a recent study by the EDHC Risk has found that climate change can have an adverse impact on global shareholder returns and global asset valuation that amount to 40% of the net present value of future losses if we continue with our current mitigation action. Yet, some investors still subscribe to the view that unless they have a specific mandate to consider climate risks, they are not supposed to do so. This is incorrect from the common law standpoint, as clearly demonstrated by the reports issued by the UK FMLC, the NZLA, and the UNPRI. It would be a different matter if investors are specifically precluded from taking into account ESG or climate risks or making ESG-related investments, as seen in the controversial anti-ESG legislation in some of the states in the US. But this is an exception rather than the norm. From an investor's point of view, there are 2 types of climate risks. One is investment-specific risk, and the other is systemic risk. Investment-specific risks concern climate impacts on specific investments. Systemic risks are broader economy risks that affect the entire portfolios held by investors that cannot be easily diversified away. In panel 1, Michael Tang from SGX mentioned about universal owners. Now that's why the UK FMLC states that climate risk can be assessed at 3 levels: at the specific investment level, at the portfolio level, and at the whole economists or systems level that are material to the fund. The importance of systemic risk was highlighted last week at the UNPRI conference in Toronto. Now, I'd like to invite Cynthia to tell us more about the fiduciary duties that investors owe in the context of climate change. Over to you, Cynthia.
Thank you, and thank you for this invitation. I'm sorry not to be able to be there in person. It sounds like you've had a deeply engaging series of discussions today. This panel was started with the question, can fiduciaries be in breach of their fiduciary duties by failing to consider climate change? And I would say that the answer to that question is clearly yes. The only case so far to sue a pension fund for its climate change actions was in Australia for its failure to incorporate climate change, and young beneficiaries, young future beneficiaries sued in McVeigh versus Rest, Retail Employees Superannuation Trust, and settled. The case was settled on very favorable terms to the young beneficiaries, with the pension fund making specific commitments to incorporate climate change into their portfolio construction going forward. In that case, actuaries had shown that young beneficiaries would be seeing a 50% drop in the ultimate value of their pension entitlement by the fund's failure to incorporate climate change risks and opportunities into their portfolio constructions. Now, how does this view comport with general principles of fiduciary obligations across common law systems? Generally speaking, there are three fiduciary duties that pension trustees and their delegates need to consider. The first is a duty of loyalty, often described as the exclusive benefit rule, and I'll come back to that in a moment. The second is a duty of prudence, and I'll come back to that one too. And the third is a duty to consider carefully intergenerational equity. So the exclusive benefit idea is a duty of loyalty admonition. It requires trustees and anyone to whom they delegate power to put the fund and its beneficiaries first in all of their thinking and their interests, which are financial interests. What does it preclude? It precludes giving a management mandate to your brother-in-law because it is your brother-in-law. It precludes giving an investment mandate to your best friend from college. These are the kinds of conflicts of interest that this admonition suggests will be a breach of fiduciary duty. Now, the duty of prudence is the duty to incorporate all information reasonably available relevant to the financial risks and returns being evaluated, and has come increasingly to be understood as a duty to diversify one's assets across different asset classes. And then intergenerational equity. The funds may not undermine the long-term interests of the fund and its beneficiaries for short-term either financial gain or political interests. Now, the exclusive benefit idea, does that permit incorporation of non-financial information, given that the benefit is a financial benefit ultimately to beneficiaries? So long as, quote, non-financial information is of financial significance, then it not only may be incorporated, but in many cases must be incorporated. That was the implication of the studies that Professor Lin started this panel with. That was also the very serious conclusion across jurisdictions of the Freshfields reports. The first in 2005 under Paul Watchman, Professor Paul Watchman's remit, and the second in 2021. Both reports were undertaken for the United Nations and the Principles of Responsible Investment. So long as climate change is by today understood as a financially material risk across most industries and most geographies, it must be considered as part of an investment fund's portfolio construction and management. Now, I'm going to stop there, leave it to further questions to develop these points, and looking forward to hearing my co-panelists' views.
So I have a follow-up question, Cynthia, before I
Yes.
ask the other panelists questions. Now, McVeigh versus Rest, the Australian case that you mentioned, is a good example of how a pension fund trustee runs the risk of being sued for not providing proper disclosure of its climate risk. But as I've alluded to earlier, unfortunately in the US, fiduciaries have been sued for taking into account climate or ESG considerations. So, for example, in Tennessee, the Attorney General sued BlackRock for breaching consumer protection law for misleading consumers about the scope of its ESG activity. And certain states in the US have passed laws that ban investors who have taken into account ESG or climate risks and considerations from entering into business transactions with the state. Cindy, in your view, are these just idiosyncratic ideological developments in the US, or do you think there will be wider implications for investors from Asia? What lessons can we learn from these developments in the US?
Well, that's a very interesting question. My conclusion, and I'll give you my reasons in a moment, my conclusion is that this is a, so far, US specific development, and it is primarily fueled by anti-climate change activism among 25 states where Republican attorneys general have taken the lead in challenging what they see as excessive concern with climate change or with diversity and inclusion. Now, you mentioned two different kinds of examples. The first one in Tennessee, that was really a greenwashing complaint. And greenwashing concerns are being observed and recognized by securities regulators across Asia and across the world. What BlackRock had done was to proclaim itself as, as a climate change warrior, if you will, that they were going to be net zero by 2050. They were co-founders of the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero. And yet they still are the world's largest fossil fuel investor and have continued to pour money into fossil fuel investments since the Paris Agreement. And so that sort of consumer protection case is one that a range of asset managers and banks can face for saying that they are doing things that they are not in fact doing to meet the urgent needs of transition to a low carbon or a net zero economy. Now, the other example is one example of many of anti-ESG legislation that's been passed in the same 25 Republican-dominated states in the U.S. In fact, all of the legislation that has been passed, except two examples, Texas and Oklahoma, I'll get back to those in a minute, all of the legislation precludes asset managers and pension funds from incorporating environmental, social, and governance information into their portfolio constructions unless those considerations represent pecuniary risk. Well, that is simply a restatement of what fiduciary law already requires, right? A fund cannot put its own or its asset manager's own political views front and center. That would be a breach of the exclusive benefit duty of loyalty obligation. However, the overwhelming evidence is that these are pecuniary considerations, climate change and nature risk in particular, or in other jurisdictions, labor risk, for instance. The two most extreme laws that have been passed were passed in Texas and Oklahoma, which actually sought to blacklist banks that had joined the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, GFANZ. And the Oklahoma ban has been challenged in court, and the lower court in Oklahoma found that the ban violated the Oklahoma Constitution. That case is up on appeal. Most other states where purported blacklist bans were introduced, those laws were not passed. And in fact, many Republicans, even in Republican-dominated states, refused to support such laws because they were, quote, not consistent with free market principles. So it's still a system in flux. From everything I've seen, these anti-ESG initiatives have caused changes in large asset managers' voting behavior on shareholder resolutions, but have not caused changes in their actual investment and portfolio construction behavior. I mean, even BlackRock is still starting to pour money into transition, innovation, and we hope that that will continue, although more quietly. And the only thing that seems to be universally banned is the use of the term ESG.
Well, thank you, Cindy. So, in my view, the difficulty is not about whether investors have a duty to consider climate risks and opportunities, but how they should go about doing so. So, one way to understand how investors should discharge their legal duties in considering climate risks and opportunities is by conducting climate scenario analysis. Scenario analysis allows a company to understand how it might perform under different hypothetical climate futures. The scenarios that are chosen can affect the pricing of risks. Underpricing of climate risks has been problematic. For example, the UK pensions regulator recently raised concerns over scenario impacts that, quote, seem relatively benign and appears to be at odds with established science, unquote. The UK Financial Stability Board warned that the scenarios used to assess risks to the financial system may understate climate vulnerability. Now, I would like to invite the panelists to speak about how they, as an asset owner or as an asset manager, look at climate risks and opportunities. How do you balance returns against risk in the context of climate impact? How do you assess the climate impact on your portfolio companies? I would like to invite Ghislaine Nadeau to speak about this issue.
Thank you, Ernest, and also thank you, Cynthia, for your sharing. Very interesting to hear your views on the US developments, and we might touch upon that later, but actually that is something what I have seen as well, that for example, the ESG term, we're not using it, but we're still, of course, doing the work that covers it. But what Cynthia also mentioned is that climate change is a financial and material risk, so it must be considered in portfolio construction. And yes, I agree on that, so I will touch upon that and explain actually how we approach that in practice. So maybe first, briefly about Robeco. Robeco is an active global asset manager headquartered in the Netherlands as well. And our clients are institutional and wholesale clients. And we specialize in sustainable investing already for more than 2 decades. So that means that we integrate environmental, social, and governance elements in our investment processes and decisions. Why do we focus on sustainable investing? Well, we truly believe that investee companies with sustainable business practices have a competitive advantage and are more successful in the long term. Via integrating ESG frameworks into our investment processes, we are able to make better informed investment decisions and to reduce the overall risks in our portfolios. And climate change is a systemic risk and presents clear financial risks. So we are committed to contribute to making our contribution to meet the Paris Agreement, and we have also launched a net zero roadmap in 2020 to be net zero by 2050. And our roadmap consists of 6 underlying pillars, or 3 elements. And first of all, it's our first pillar focuses on decarbonizing our activities. That is our own business operations, but an important element under this pillar is, of course, decarbonizing our portfolios. Secondly, we aim to accelerate the transition. And how do we do that? Accelerate the transition of companies via engagement, and we will touch upon that later as well, and also for climate action by countries. And lastly, promoting climate-aligned investing, so working with clients on decarbonization and collaborate to promote net zero investing in various initiatives. So managing climate risk is relevant for our entire net zero roadmap, but of course especially on decarbonizing our portfolios and accelerating the transition of companies. So in that regard, how do we manage climate risk? Well, we have a sustainability risk policy in place, and climate change is, of course, one of those sustainability risks. Maybe more practical as well, the policies owned by our financial risk management department, which reports to our risk management committee, which reports to our board, but the portfolio managers have the responsibility to implement the policy. This policy is applicable to all our entities and applicable to all our funds under management, and in principles as well to our mandates. And we have to align with the EU SFDR because we are, of course, headquartered in Europe, in the Netherlands, and we report the outcome of the monitoring reports. We have monthly reports. So this policy is based on 3 pillars. First of all, the first pillar focuses on applying minimum sustainability requirements, which is investment exclusions and ESG integration. So taking ESG factors into our investment process. The second pillar is focusing on investment restrictions based on specific ESG activities or objectives of a strategy. So that can be strategies that are focusing on reducing environmental footprint, on having a positive impact on the SDGs. So pillar 1, these 2 pillars focus on investment compliance with the sustainability investment guidelines and regulations. And pillar 3 focuses on sustainability and climate risk analysis and awareness. And so this pillar really focuses on financial risks in which sustainability risks and exposures are translated into potential financial losses. And this is where the climate scenarios come to, where we cover climate scenarios, climate risk scenarios. So if we talk about climate risk, we talk about, of course, about transition risks, about physical risks. And to assess and manage climate risk, we use various climate risk scenarios, internal and external. And the external scenarios that we use are, first of all, the one from the Dutch regulator, the DNB. That's the leading one that we use as we are headquartered in the Netherlands. But we also apply external scenarios. So MSCI is one of the external scenarios that we use, and the one of the network of greening the financial system, the NGFS. And what we see is that, and that's also the challenge, that scenarios have a different scope, a different timeline, and a different, some have a are sector specific, some are company specific, some have a time horizon until 2050, and some have a time horizon of 5 years. Some focus on transition risks, some focus on physical risks. So to prevent tunnel vision, we apply all those various scenarios, so those external scenarios and also our internal scenarios that are based on research and based on our own analysis. If we talk about research, we use studies of the Dutch Central Bank, but also the Bank of England, KPMG, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and Stockholm Environmental Institute. So for all our funds, we do stress testing against these different scenarios, and after evaluation of all these scenarios, we define our approach. And in that regard, we look at active returns. And some of the challenges, as I mentioned indeed, is that scenarios have different scopes, different timelines, but also scenarios don't take always into account that the market is changing, the geopolitical changes. So I think this is something that we have to be aware of.
Thank you so much. I would like now to invite Mr. Dylan Pillay to share with us Temasek's approach towards balancing returns against risk and approach towards assessing climate impact on the extensive portfolio companies.
Okay, thank you, Edmund. Can you hear me? Yeah. First of all, I'm happy to be here. I'm an alumnus of NUS Law School. I like to say that you can leave the law, but the law never leaves you, as this conference has proven to me. Seems like I missed a very interesting session earlier today on things to do with climate impact in particular. So maybe if I may just also comment briefly on what Professor Williams said. I think the question that we have to ask ourselves as an enterprise is, what is your mandate and what's the duration of your capital? As an investor, you're much governed by your mandate. And there are different categories of investors. For example, we're a sovereign wealth fund by definition, but we're also an investment holding company of different operating businesses. So we own our own assets. We're not a manager of assets. Okay, that's the first thing, right? But our shareholder can decide whether they agree with what strategy we put forward, and they can either choose to remove us as directors or vote against resolutions which require their approval. Now, then you could have hedge funds, which are very much dependent upon returns based on market volatility. Very short-term orientation, because they will use many different instruments to offset typical long-only returns with short-term fixes. You have private equity, which is also dictated by duration, typically 10 years, +1. That duration dictates what you have to take into consideration to maximize value for shareholders. There's no requirement for stakeholder duties and responsibilities there. You're given a mandate to give a return, and your requirements to give that return, and you can only raise your next fund if you're amongst the best investors, which means top quartile or second quartile based on rankings. So, and then you've got the long-only funds, you've got venture capital funds, you've got growth funds, I can go through a whole litany, you've got private credit and so on, infrastructure funds. So your mandate and the duration of capital dictates the strategies you have to put in place in order to deliver as a fiduciary, to your stakeholders. Now for us, because we own our own capital And because we own our own assets and we're a typical company, so as you know, the shareholders don't own the assets. You own the assets, and then of course the shareholders' right to get proceeds from liquidation. It's quite different. So we can set a strategy and deliver on that. The one thing our government requires of us as a shareholder is to deliver long-term sustainable returns. Long-term sustainable returns. Well, let me tell you something about long-term sustainable returns. You have to have both a long strategy and a short strategy. Because to build up the muscle to deliver things on long term, you have to also have short-term strategies, because you need to build muscle in interim, because things are evolving quite rapidly, and cycles are getting shorter and shorter, especially in the business world. But it's getting shorter and shorter also in the context of understanding the big shifts in the marketplace, whether it's sustainable living, whether it's longer lifespans, or whatever else could be relevant in the context of building a reasonably resilient portfolio for the long term. So when you look at that and you look at risks, you look at the risks associated with overall portfolio. I like the way somebody put it earlier. You look at it from an investor perspective, a portfolio perspective, a systems perspective. Good way of thinking about that. Every investment has its own risk and reward equation, but the portfolio itself has to have balanced risk across the board, because you're required to give a risk-adjusted return over your cost of capital. That's the best way to deliver long-term sustainable returns. So you focus primarily on cost of capital. Because if you're getting above your cost of capital, then you're actually earning effectively alpha for your stakeholders or for a return to your shareholder. If you're below that, then actually, in actual fact, you're not making good use of capital from a risk-adjusted basis. So if you look at the cost of capital, then in the context of sustainability, and especially climate change, the issue is whether over the long term, as you look at the impact of climate change over a reasonably forecasted period of time, do you have a resilient portfolio? Okay, do you have a resilient portfolio? And then you got to figure out what's going to impact the cost of capital of what you already have in your portfolio. And then if it's going to be impacted, how do you ameliorate it with other things that you have to do to offset that impact? Now, why is this important? If you look at the shifts which are happening in the marketplace today, I'll just highlight a few. Number one is that central banks are requiring banks to undertake environmental risk management processes to understand the risks associated with loan books that they have and the proprietary books that they maintain for their own investments. Which means that if there is a lot of risk associated, whether it's transition risk or physical risk, for example, in terms of lending to particular types of companies, think Florida real estate. Then the question you have to ask yourself is, what are the risks there, and whether you have, in fact, an issue with your loan book. So they're taking that into consideration. What is the consequence of that? The consequence of that is that your spreads on loans will increase. So your base interest rate is one thing, but the spread is really what you're paying to borrow. And if your risk profile gets heightened and what you call a risk premium goes up, you're paying more to borrow on a like-for-like basis. The second, so for example, it will cost you a lot more to borrow for real estate in some countries than in other countries, depending on whether the exposure to natural disasters, etc., is higher there than not. And today we're learning a lot more, we're learning a lot more about the unpredictability of natural disasters than we did before. In 2019, we invested in NatCat, that's natural catastrophe insurance, based on 50 years data going backwards. And we said, wow, this is a fantastic business. And reinsurance companies were underwriting and so on, and we did it, and we lost our pants on it. We lost, Why? Because within 12 months, you have floods, bushfires, all sorts of natural disasters which weren't happening in places where it was happening. Now, it was happening in places that you expect, you would model it out and say, when do you expect it to happen? But even then, it was happening faster than what was modeled. Today, I think NatCat can only be done by the reinsurers, because they have the data, the seismic data, the atmospheric data, etc., to determine what are the real risks. Now, which comes back to the issue of fiduciary duty. So today, would I want to do NatCat insurance? No way. It would be a breach of my fiduciary duty to do so. But we're learning so much about these things because scientific data is becoming more precise, but changes in atmospheric conditions and so on are actually beyond scientific data. Okay, and we have to bear in mind this issue. So as you think about it, then if you look at portfolio risk for the returns, you have to see what is your overall portfolio risk, and you've got to decide where do you want to invest and what kind of things you want to get for your long-term cost of capital. The second is insurance premium will go up, so that's something, but the question is whether you even have an insurable asset. What if you can't get it underwritten? what happens if your insurer comes to you and says, you know what, I'm not insuring you. Forget about how much you want to pay me. I'm not insuring you. I'm not taking a risk on this book. What happens then? You have a stranded asset, possibly. Worse still, if the core business is that, you have a stranded business model. The third thing is, when you look at all these increases for your cost of capital, then you put it into asset pricing model, and your cost of capital for the investment goes up, and then your return requirements go up. And that may make this asset a less investable asset than you thought of a few years earlier. So as an investor, especially for us because we own our assets, we have to think carefully about the long-term effect of climate change on the assets we own. Now, I'll tell you a couple other things that come about. We all know about the task force on climate-related financial disclosures. It was all put into things to do with, with financial statements, but also with disclosures for listing rules and so on across the world. Today, ISSB has come up with requirements. That's the International Sustainability Standards Board, run by a very interesting man called Emmanuel Faber, who, when he was CEO of Danone, started to disclose carbon-adjusted EPS and was voted out by his board. He was a little bit ahead of his time. But you have to think about those things, because now ISSB requires you to think about the impact on your financial statements as a result of all these sustainability-related events. They're now going to go to the task force for nature-based financial disclosures. Now, I don't know how to calculate nature-based financial disclosures, to be honest. Climate-based, to some extent, you can put a carbon tax cost or internal carbon pricing costs, which we have done for ourselves internally for our returns, for our cost of capital. You can do that and determine what the potential impact could be. How do you do it for nature? And then, by the way, there's a real tension between addressing climate change on one side and addressing nature on the other. Take, for example, building of data centers. You can build a green data center, but if it affects the biodiversity where you build it, you've got a problem with TNFD. You have no problems with TCFD, but you have a problem with TNFD. I say all these things because directors' fiduciary duties go towards the veracity of financial statements when you disclose them, because it opens you up to litigation. So while your fiduciary duties in terms of whether you should take into account climate change impact in the context of your business decisions may be more settled because of that case in the UK, Climate Earth versus Shell, well, for the time being, there's a separate line of litigation that can come about because of financial statements. Okay, and in Singapore, you've got statutory liability for financial statements which are not correct under section, I think, 199, right? Is it 199? I studied law so long ago, I can't remember. I stopped practicing 14 years ago, but it is an issue for directors. Now, I come back to this issue of a risk and reward. So the concept of an investor is risk-adjusted returns. Now, if you're a pension fund investor, sovereign wealth fund investor, you're allowed to take a very long-term view. If you're allowed to take a very long-term view, you have to take into account climate. If you're not allowed to take a long-term view, then you've got to question yourself whether by taking into account climate, you're in breach of your mandate. Okay, I'm not going to say anything about that because everybody should look at the mandate and figure it out. You know? But that's the problem people like BlackRock and other investment managers have. What is the mandate given to you? And it's a very relevant question to ask. If your mandate is to invest for ESG, and you've got to invest for ESG, no matter what the state law says, because otherwise you've got a problem. Because you breach your mandate, you then have to close shop effectively. So this issue today of climate change, quite apart from the fact it's polarized, is actually fraught with difficulties for investors and for companies. Because we're still at the early stages of learning about what we have to take into consideration. Remember, most sections in the Commonwealth on fiduciary duties were written up before many of the risks that we are encountering today could even have been in contemplation of people. And even though climate change has been in contemplation since Margaret Thatcher's speech at the United Nations in 1990, nobody has changed the law to give any guidance on whether these considerations are relevant or not. So I'll leave that with you because I don't think I like litigation to be the arbiter of what a director should do, because that's not the way, I think, to deal with the issue at hand. Can I answer your question?
Yes, you did brilliantly. Thank you so much. Can I ask you a quick question, which is that you quite like the framework or the approach set up by the UK FMLC, in which they said that
intuitively, I like it. I have to
the climate risk can be assessed at three principal levels: at the whole economy's level, namely systemic risk; at the portfolio level and at the specific asset or specific investment level, could there be potential conflicts in the way in the way an asset owner assess these three layers of risk?
I mean, there will always be conflicts when you have a multi-asset portfolio, say between credit, equity, for example, infrastructure, equity, and things like that. So for a multi-asset manager or owner, like a sovereign wealth fund, there are trade-offs that you have to make. So there are going to be conflicts. System, you've got to define system, right?
At a whole economy's
Yeah.
level, for example.
Yeah, the whole economy itself. Well, then that is for government to set aside policies like, for example, carbon tax. Okay? And you impose carbon tax for two reasons. One is to make sure that you remain as a competitive economy. And secondly, because climate change is important and you do not want to have a situation where it becomes an existential problem for future generations. If you believe in intergenerational equity, then it's a question of risk sharing between the current generation and future generations as a result of actions of the current generation that can impact future generations. So I look at incentives and disincentives at systems level. What are incentives for you to do the right thing to start your journey? Because remember, transition, especially just transition, is a journey. And what are disincentives for you to continue doing the stuff you should not be doing even after solutions have been made available for you to switch or to transition? And I think that's where you are at the systems level. The portfolio level is where you are required to give a return from a multitude of assets to your stakeholder. Okay, so that's my job. And investment level is what each team looks at to see whether the capital allocated to them will give them the optimized return over a particular duration, because their duration will, you see, at the portfolio level, your duration is generally longer term because you're looking at an institutional approach to getting a return. But at the individual investment level, that could be by reference to a sub-portfolio, and that has different considerations depending on duration. So if you have a 5-year duration, well, I think it's going to be very difficult for you to take into account 15-year changes or switch or potential impact in the way you invest today. But then the tricky part is, if the carbon abatement cost curve of solutions accelerates, then you're going to have an impact in the shorter duration as against what you thought was going to be the normal duration. So yes, there are trade-offs. And
Thank
there are
you very
conflicts.
much.
Yeah.
Now,
But you should ask the lady next to me
Definitely.
because she's an asset manager.
no, she's
I'm an asset owner.
Well, I will be coming to YK because Dylan mentioned a very important point right at the start, right? He said number one depends on your mandate, and number two depends on your duration. And he said that different kinds of funds will have different mandates and different kinds of duration. Temasek is an asset owner, unlike Robeco, which is an asset manager. Now, I would like to move on to YK. And APG is an asset owner, and we know that it is one of the world's most progressive asset owners. So I'm interested to find out what's APG's strategies and approach towards balancing risks against balancing returns against risk, and how do you assess the climate impact on your portfolio companies?
Yeah, okay. So I'll start with APG and ABP. So the ABP is our parent, who is most, I think you're quite right in the sense that one of the most progressive pension fund in the world, pension funds in the world. APG, my company, is I think 95% child. So that we are literally, so at commercial asset manager, asset owner, we are in the middle, so 1.5. So if Temasek is 1, Robeco is 2, then we are 1.5. So that we are in so I mean, I'm a lucky child in a sense that ABP, our parent, decides all the policies. What we do, what APG does is just implement. So we don't have a separate policy, but we just implement. Very luckily, ABP, our parent, is saying that, let's say we did, so one of the things, how do we assess and et cetera, we've done assessment long time ago. That was 2015. We calculated most of the, carbon-related calculations, et cetera, et cetera. If you think about now, carbon calculation footprint, everybody seems to know without any issues. But if I go back to, memory back to, let's say, 5 years ago or 10 years ago, the numbers were horrific. So let's say 10 to 20%, there's a hard number, and then we didn't know where the number came from. And so that there were a lot of assumptions and et cetera, but we've done that. Now, when you do the assessment, what do? You assess forever? No. You're doing measurement and assessment to make a judgment. So that I think what our parent wanted to make a decision is that, let's say, okay, we have numbers. We have done enough assessment. It's time for make a judgment. So that judgment came. So that, let's say, our pension parent, I think what they think about every single day is that, let's say, we want to be an investor. We want to be a responsible investor. If we put our money into, let's say, financing this fossil fuel producers and et cetera, we cannot possibly call ourselves responsible investor. So that I think about early 2020, they sort of secretly made a decision to divest all of the fossil fuel producers. So that now made a decision, we are implementing it, we have no, there's a threshold. The threshold is 1%. If any company, the revenue is more than 1%, we are divesting it. So that in our portfolio, entire, I think it's a 550 billion euro, we don't have oil stock. We don't have gas stock. We don't have coal. We don't have those dirty, let's say, fossil fuel investment. That's a judgment call. No one said that we should do it, but then we did it and we implemented it. And then we are moving on. So I think it's just assessment, measurement that's important, and then putting, let's say, 2050 net zero target, et cetera, that's important. But at some point, we need to make a decision and move on. So that, and then I think part of the things we can do is our mandate is we need to, we just simply wanted to be a responsible investor in the world. Yeah.
Thank you so much, YK. Gillian, you have something to say?
Yeah, I wanted to give a comment on just more an observation, because I think what you see is, of course, that, of course, what you could say is that the European financial institutions have been working on sustainability already for a long time. That's also the case for Robeco. So we have all kind of policies in place, all systems in place, focusing on investing sustainably, responsibly. Now, if we are in Asia, we are talking about the transition. And sometimes our strategies or our policies are maybe not so fit for the transition, because it's where can you make impact in looking at those companies that have a difficult footprint, but using your influence to change them. So I think that's a bit of a challenge maybe for European investors. I say it in a general way, and I think there's an opportunity for investors and financial institutions in this region, because they are more flexible to adapt their policies and approaches to the transition, and they also have still exposure to these companies and can use their influence instead of if you are already divested from these companies.
So, thank you so much, Gillian. I think it's a very nice segue to the next segment of the panel, in which we will talk about engagement strategies. Now, so in order for asset managers and asset owners to discharge their duty to balance returns against risks, they should exercise stewardship over their investment. I think this is quite straightforward. But what does this mean in the context of climate risk? There are a variety of engagement strategies. One at the extreme end is divestment, which is the approach that APP has taken. Am I right? So we simply do not invest in fossil fuel companies because this is inconsistent with our understanding of what a responsible investor is. But this is APP, but it is not representative. And there are other engagement strategies that investors can deploy, such as private dialogues with board and management. It could escalate to public criticisms. They can vote to elect or remove the directors. They can vote for or against proposed resolutions. They can themselves even file shareholder proposals. And in the extreme case, and may not be that extreme, depending on how you look at it, and which has been a subject matter of discussion in the past two panels, derivative actions. Shareholders can bring an action against the board of directors for breaching their duties on behalf of the company, as is evidenced in the Client Earth versus Shell case. So let me begin by asking the panelists this fundamental question. What are the key objectives of your stewardship policy in Asia? And what are the engagement strategies that you have deployed and which you have found to be rather effective in promoting decarbonization in your portfolio companies? Perhaps I can start with Dylan.
Yeah, so for those of you interested, we issued our first sustainability report this year, and it's on our website. And the reason why we did this is because, as I mentioned, we own operating companies, so we wanted to have a more complete picture, not just what Temasek is doing, but what our portfolio companies are doing. So just to let you know that for Temasek, actually our own portfolio, aside from our operating companies, is pretty low carbon intensive. And our weighted average carbon intensity for portfolio keeps dropping. And that's because the areas where we invest are actually low carbon areas, things like technology and so on. So but of course you have to think about scope 3. Yeah? So we haven't really measured the full impact of scope 3 yet because there are massive issues with scope 3, including how do you really account for it properly? How do you make sure there's no double counting and things like that? But I put that aside for the time being. The question, for us is twofold. One is, what do we do with the companies that we control? Because those companies we're going to own for the longest time. We've owned some of these companies for 50 years. We might own them for another 50 years. We own an airline. Okay, we have a commitment to reduce our carbon emissions to 50% of what it was in 2010. We're on our way there, except for one thing, the airline. Unless we have sustainable aviation fuel, we're not going to get there. As long as some of you fly around everywhere, you're going to use our airline. But let me tell you, our fleet is 25 to 30% more fuel efficient than most fleets out there. So remember that when you all are flying. But okay, so now the commercial's over. But you see, that the reality is that, right? So if we have businesses which are carbon emitting, then how can we not invest in carbon emitting businesses, provided we're there to encourage them on a road towards reducing carbon? So whether you call it decarbonization or whatever, how do we influence that outcome? So I used to say that we will not invest in fossil fuel businesses. That was before, in 2019. I've changed my position. Because if we are a responsible investor, then we should be helping those companies reduce the emissions in the production of fossil fuels. Because regardless of what we're thinking, in 2050 at net zero, we will still need natural gas to hit net zero. We have to be real about the capital needed to move to green. It is not one size fits all across the world. If you look at this part of the world, Southeast Asia, where more than 50% of power generation is coal-fired power plants, which are between the average age of 12 and 15 years in each country, how are you going to phase it out unless someone's paying for the phasing out? Who's paying for it? Especially when its PPAs are negotiated at double-digit returns, and renewable energy plants at single-digit returns. So if you don't, and then the question comes, do you have voluntary credits? And there's a big controversy over voluntary credits, but you need voluntary credits for either nature-based solutions or to plug the gap in transition. Then comes the fact, okay, you want to phase out coal-fired power plants and you want to move to green. Who's paying for the grid? Who's paying for grid stability, grid capacity, grid management services, energy storage systems? So I would say one thing here, which is that we are all on a journey for just transition. In the developed world, we can say energy transition, for example, or transition equals, could be energy security, and therefore in the long run, energy security includes green. In the emerging world, EMDEs, energy transition is energy affordability. The cheapest cost to produce electricity for communities where they don't have even access to running water is actually coal. If you're going to replace coal with green, somebody's got to pay for it. Who's paying for it? Right? If these companies could afford to pay for it, believe me, they won't be looking at coal. Yeah? So I think we have to see that. So when we look at it for our own companies, we have a climate transition readiness framework that we put in place to actually work with them on their journey. So we own a port operator. How can you make sure you electrify everything, use autonomous vehicles? How can you ensure that people who use the ports have less Scope 3 emissions compared to other ports? Look at ammonia bunkering, for example, especially when you have dual fuel ships, which are, one side ammonia, one side natural gas. You can't have just purely ammonia for various reasons, including safety. How do you do that, right? For example, on the airline side, we are partnering with Changi Airport and Singapore Airlines to have SAF used in Singapore, sustainable aviation fuel. But there's a fundamental issue with sustainable aviation fuel, which is not just the refinery process and the cost, which is 4 to 6 times jet fuel, but feedstock. Real problem. And the technology is 40, 50 years old, or even longer, HEPA and Fischer-Tosh. So maybe you have to look at synthetic e-fuels to make it workable. What I'm trying to say here is that it is not an easy thing to do the just transition, okay, at all. And we have hard-to-abate, companies in hard-to-abate sectors like power generation. Singapore has 96% natural gas, 4% solar. Our land, 729 square kilometers, doesn't allow us to have more than 8 or 9% solar, or maybe 10% max. The rest has got to be natural gas until we import green electrons to balance it out, which is only 20, 30 upwards. We have to redo our grid also for that. If we wanted to do full solar, we can put floating solar